Thanks for coming. Thanks, Faye, so much for the invitation and for the introduction. So as Faye said, I will be talking about the work that I did with two drug treatment services in Liverpool and in Athens. This is a book that I recently published, Becoming with Care in Drug Treatment Services, the Recovery Assemblage, which started as a PhD project in sociology at the University of Liverpool. Just a little bit of background, just to say where my interest in recovery from drugs and alcohol comes from. A while back, I did a training in art therapy at a drug recovery center in Athens. And following that, I worked as a recovery practitioner in Greece and in the UK. And that's how the idea developed to do a PhD looking at different practices, recovery practices in Liverpool and in Athens. Originally, it was supposed to be a comparative study, which is comparing practices can be quite problematic. I will talk about that more in a bit, but the project basically evolved from that kind of professional experience. So just to give you a little bit of context on the history of drug use and treatment in Greece, which I assume most people might not be familiar with. So in Greece, in general, things tend to happen late. So in the 80s, while already drug use was a big public health and social issue in Europe and in the UK, it only appears at that time in the Greek press as a major social issue in the 1980s. So that's time, obviously, that HIV rates amongst injecting drug users are rising in many parts of the world. This doesn't happen in Greece, that HIV positive drug users rates remain very low until 2012. And this potentially partially explains why harm reduction practices did not really evolve in Greece at that time. Another interesting thing about Greece is that there is an absence of concrete drug policies and governmental interventions, which does not really mean that the state doesn't have a punitive approach towards drug use, but there is no, the programs, the recovery programs can kind of develop as they wish, and there's no one central drug policy that tells them how to practice drug treatment. So there is funding that goes into public drug treatment services. This is unconditional in the sense that it's not linked to specific policies. It also doesn't mean that it's a lot of money going into the services. It just means that treatment services at the time and the professionals working in them have the opportunity to develop initiatives and interventions as they see them fit. So within this context, there are two main services that start growing. GETHEA, established in 1983, is the first semi-public drug treatment space. It starts as a therapeutic community, which is based on the standards of Emil Hove in the Netherlands. And then 80 Nano is the service that I worked with when I was doing fieldwork in Athens. Now, this is a service that was and administratively still belongs to the Psychiatric Clinic of Athens. Its history goes way back in the 1920s when people who were using drugs and alcohol were basically imprisoned in the Psychiatric Clinic of Athens. This starts changing in 1972 when a building within the clinic, actually the upper floor of a building, of the building 18, which is where the name of the service comes from, is given to people who use drugs and alcohol, and this becomes a dedicated space for them. And this is how specific treatment approaches to drug and alcohol start developing. So the therapeutic principles of the program are set in 1987, when the drug professionals of 80 Nano at the time decide that treatment has to become voluntary, and the program stops accepting mandatory admissions following court orders. Interestingly, people working in 18 nano are not looking at other drug treatment interventions in different countries, in different contexts, but they are mainly drawing on the principles of the anti-psychiatric movement and institutional psychotherapy. So they're interested in what Jean-Noury and Félix Guattari are doing in France in the clinic Laborde. They're looking at the anti-psychiatric movement in Italy, initiated by Franco Basaglia and Franco Rotelli. And in general, they're looking at interventions that are co-produced with patients. And this was also something that was picked up by Claude Olivenstein, who started the service Marmottan, drug treatment service Marmottan in Paris. And 18 nano basically looks at that to develop some of its own practices. Now, this is a highly political and politicized context. And within that, abstinence becomes kind of a political project. This kind of draws on Marxist ideologies, looking at drug use as a mechanism that the state uses to oppress people. And within the program, they argue that abstinence is linked to people's ability to resist to the system. Interestingly, this approach is funded by the state that are not very much interested in the theoretical roots of the program. Now, this is just some quotes from an interview. The first one is an interview that I did with the head of research of 18 nano, where he talks about the first steps towards developing the program, what happened when this transition started taking place from drug users and alcoholics being imprisoned in a psychiatric facility towards that developing to a drug treatment center. He says there were bars everywhere. At some point, it was decided that we can't operate like that anymore, so we cut them all down. And of course, the door was open because it was well known that whoever wanted to leave could just leave. That's when symbolically, really, it became obvious that we are now something different. Sorry. And then the second quote is from this short book that Félix Guattari wrote in 1989, unfortunately has not been translated in English. When he visited Leros, which is was a notoriously inhumane psychiatric facility in Greece. And towards the end of his trip, he's invited to visit 18 nano. And he says, like a deus ex machina, or like a happy end, we find ourselves in a model clinic for 30 drug addicts and alcoholics. The walls have been painted by the personnel and the patients. Here, all methods of one-to-one and group therapy are used, music, psychodrama, relaxation techniques. But the clinic is relatively unknown because of its operation within Daphne, which is the psychiatric clinic of Athens, which has such a bad reputation. So this is very briefly the history of 18 anno. And now just a few comments really on the UK drug treatment context. The first Dangerous Drugs Act, written in the 1920s, describes drug use as the manifestation of a disease requiring a medical response, which I think it's interesting because it very early on opens the way for the medicalization of drug use. Now, since then, there are a lot of grassroots initiatives, and these are both recovery initiatives and harm reduction initiatives that gradually get absorbed by policy, by the main state policy on drugs and alcohol, which leads to an over-professionalization of the services. So, for example, in the 1970s, there is the so-called heroin epidemic that leads the government to provide funding to voluntary organizations that are already in operation. And then there is obviously the HIV epidemic in the 80s that leads to the acknowledgement of the success of the first needle exchange scheme and the establishment of harm reduction as a drug policy. And now following harm reduction, recovery is becomes UK's main drug treatment policy, and it is very much written and to an extent practiced as a neoliberal political project that aims to ensure that people are abstinent in order to return to employment, in order to be productive, to not commit crime, and all this kind of discourse that comes to recovery as it is written in policy, which is pretty much the opposite of how the story went in Greece and how recovery and abstinence were seen. These are just two quotes that I think really I find really interesting because they show the parallel trajectories really and histories of recovery and harm reduction. The first one is from Rowdy Yates, from a book that he wrote called If It Weren't for the Alligators. And he talks about the history of the Lifeline project in Manchester, which started as a space that was giving support to people who were using drugs, and its aim was to become a therapeutic community. He says Lifeline project entered the period of bureaucracy. So he's talking about the 70s, the heroin epidemic, and when the state started giving money to voluntary organizations. He said this period could have been inconceivable at its inception. Gradually, management became a thing that actually happened, rather than just something we told the funders we did. For the first time since the establishment of England's therapeutic communities in the 60s, there was a bridgehead between the NHS and the voluntary sector drugs field. But how did we get there? We hid our outlaw masks and signed as deputies in a new pose. We thought that we could sort out the ideology later. And it's interesting how this speaks to Russell Newcomb's account of harm reduction and the history of harm reduction. Newcomb was one of the people that were involved in establishing the first syringe exchange schemes in Liverpool. And he said that when the government takes over, what often happens is the community gets pushed out a bit. There's a few grants thrown at the community to show that governments and local authorities have respect for them originating the policy and being involved in it. But money mainly goes back to conventional drug services, just like they did with harm reduction. It was taken away from the community and its originators and put in the hands of professionals, some of whom are good people, others just want to do as they're told. So within this context, Gin in the Gutter, which is the service that I worked with in Liverpool, was established in 2008, and it was a recovery-focused day center. Their aim was to provide support to people, as they described it, taking the first steps in the recovery process, but they were not ready to maintain abstinence. So what this really means is that they were trying to not exclude anyone for not being able to prove that they were abstinent. So the only requirement is that people showed up at the service in a condition that they were able to basically engage with the recovery groups and the art groups taking place during the day. Their aim with that is to break the polarization between recovering and active drug users. And this was seen very positively by Liverpool City Council until 2016. So they did fund this project from 2008 until the time when most funding was withdrawn from small-scale drug and alcohol services and was reallocated to larger organizations. And Gini struggled for a while. They did secure funding from other sources, but they basically exhausted all options, so they had to shut down in 2020. Now, my aim was to tell the story of these two services, trying to look at practices and figure out who does it better just didn't seem important or viable or from the very beginning, mainly because best practices are contextual and they can't really be translated into different contexts. Also, stories are not produced nor told in isolation. They do become with the spaces, bodies, and affects as these come together for the production of context. So thinking this way made me pushed me to focus on the connections that develop between the services as well within the services themselves, rather than looking at comparisons. I won't talk too much about positionality, which obviously matters where we stand, where we try to tell stories. I just want to say that using this quote from Gomar did a research in France in a methadone clinic. And when talking about where she stood in relation to that, she says, in the midst of this debate on methadone, where actors must take a position for or against each other, where funding can be won or lost because of a rumor, I collude with the Blue Clinic team and the clients, which is the service she was working with. And I very much echo this statement. I've worked in 2 countries where austerity politics have been prevalent for a while. Healthcare is not a priority. So I believe within this context, it's really important to stand with the services we're working with the people that choose to engage with these services. And yeah, that was why I tried to observe these caring practices taking place within these 2 different environments. And both these services developed unique understandings of what recovery means and how it should be practiced. So, as I said, my focus was on observing how small practices of care were emerging through human and non-human interactions in these treatment spaces. And I decided to describe these practices through the concept of the Deleuzo-Guattarian assemblage. The assemblage, especially as it has been described and deployed by Deleuze and Guattari, is very often considered a quite complex concept. And I think that's mainly because assemblages are everywhere. Anything can be described as an assemblage. But in a nutshell, the assemblage refers to the human and non-human connections that traverse all aspects of life and the possibilities that these connections render possible or block. And Deleuze and Guattari say that by thinking life as an amalgam of forces challenges the existence of an individual that thinks and acts in isolation. So for me, that was a way to tell collective rather than individual stories. And I took this concept of the assemblage, applied it on the recovery space to explore the connections that become between people in recovery and drug treatment services, and to understand the process of recovery as something that's never fixed, but as always becoming. So not looking for the recovered subject, but the process and the encounters that become possible through this process. And I was interested in how matters of health and illness can be assessed in terms of flows and becomings, rather than stable bodies and subjects. So working with the concept of the assemblage, there are 2 books that I've found particularly helpful. One is written by Cameron Duff, Assemblages of Health. And this is a book that I read when I was doing field work in Athens, and obviously working in a recovery center can be quite intense. It can be an emotive process, and I wanted to find a way to talk about these stories without focusing on individual stories, without focusing on suffering, on success or failure. So this book basically gave me a way to talk about difficult connections and to refrain from describing individuals that think and act in isolation. I was mainly drawing on a chapter that is written about recovery from mental illness. It explains how recovery does not happen to individuals, but does emerge through a collective process of becoming well. And in this chapter, Duff identifies 3 assemblages of health that are also interconnected with each other. One of them is the material assemblage, which is the composition of the physical and symbolic territory of recovery as a space of transition. The second one is the affective assemblage, described as the generation of feelings and practices that enable new connections. And then finally, the social assemblage, that refers to the social connections that emerge within and beyond the recovery assemblage. And this is the structure that I have used to set out and describe the encounters taking place within the recovery space. Another study that I think is particularly relevant and interesting is Kim MacLeod's The Wellbeing Machine. In this book, MacLeod is looking at depression. She challenges the biomedical diagnosis of depression that looks for symptoms, and she attempts to disassociate states of ill-being with pathology and to rethink well-being in a way that doesn't blame individuals when they're not able to make the correct or the healthy choices towards improving their well-being. So she says that becoming well is a complex, non-linear process entangled with negative experiences. And this for me has been very helpful when talking about recovery, this idea of not just looking about the positive experience, but also experiences that might be considered negative. For example, this can be a way to understand relapse without blaming people for not having able to maintain abstinence. MacLeod also talks about the recovery assemblage from depression as an encounter of human and non-human components that expand the recovering body's power of acting. And she says that it's the collective desire for difference that motivates activity. So drawing on that, I was interested in looking at the care produced in the recovery assemblage, going beyond the interruption of the relationship between a body and the substance. So not just looking at what happens when people stop taking drugs, not just looking at abstinence, but all the other relationships that become possible and open different possibilities for people while they're engaging with the recovery assemblage. So I will just now discuss a couple of empirical examples. I will start by looking at the material recovery assemblage. So looking at the different materialities, tools that are available in the recovery space and how these were used by Ginny. So this, I'm looking at Liverpool for these examples and how they were deployed to enhance the connection and the interaction between service users and their recovery space. One of the practice that, a daily practice really, was checking in with people. So while I was working at Ginny, every morning we had to text people with the program for the day, all the groups taking place, and then we had to call people, encouraging them to show up. So this is a simple caring practice that also requires some attention and awareness of people's schedules. We all, every day we knew we were expecting to come, so we were calling them to see if they're doing all right. And it's just a very simple example of how care can extend beyond the recovery space and time. And as a practice, it does challenge a neoliberal production of subjectivity through which responsibility is placed on individuals' ability to make healthy choices. In a way, does breach the service users' agency as they have all the information. So they shouldn't be needing this encouragement to come in, and yet it seemed to be really important for them. So this as a practice is kind of challenges a logic of choice that dominates healthcare. This is a term that Anne-Marie Moll has produced to talk about how healthcare is practiced. And she says that if we move on from a logic of choice towards a logic of care, we will see how people's needs can be collectively navigated. So through this logic of care, the provision of care becomes a shared responsibility that requires all human and non-human actors involved to shift their practices and engage in ways that unblock desire. And this checking in process seemed to be quite appreciated by the service users of Ginny. Someone said that they did experience that as members of staff caring about them. They do keep an eye on you, they send you texts and they phone you up. Someone else who had stopped engaging with the service said that this gave them the opportunity to re-engage. And they said after a while, I stopped coming along. I thought I didn't need to, and I was drinking for quite a while. And then a member of staff called me one day and asked me to come back, and I did, and I've been coming back since. I don't know if anyone has worked in any recovery or any other healthcare setting, but completing forms is a big part of the day, especially when people engage with a service for the first time. And the issue with these forms is that they don't always reflect people's realities. So, for example, when someone engages with a recovery service for the first time, there is a lengthy risk assessment that has to be completed. There is a needs assessment that needs to be completed. And talking about these forms with someone working at Gini, I thought it was very interesting how these were transformed into a practice of connection and care rather than a way to quantify people's behaviors. And they said, it's not about getting someone in and filling out the form. I've filled out that form, so you go home, have a good weekend. It's about making sure it's a reality. Is that form going to help this person to get through the weekend? Are they going to walk out of here and they've got somewhere to go? And then the quote below is another example of someone who engaged in a CBT course, and they talk about how they felt that the person they had across from them was just ticking boxes. And they say that they felt that this was just someone whose job it is to do this for a couple of weeks, show that the NHS is doing something. And they said, I don't know, some politician set that up at some point. So I find that interesting because it shows that it does matter how practitioners engage with interventions and how these are experienced by the service users. Now, a final example on this practices of care developed within the material recovery assemblage is the birthday cards that were sent by people at Gini to all the service users. This is from a worker at Gini who said, a lot of people come and they get a birthday card from us. It's not rocket science, but a lot of them don't have anyone. And that makes someone come back we've not seen in months. So again, this is an example of how the material recovery assemblage extends beyond the space of recovery and reaches out to service users' personal spaces. I thought it was really interesting that it didn't matter. It is really interesting that it didn't matter how long people had not shown up at the service. They were never getting crossed off the birthday list. So this went against punishing people for not being consistent and for interrupting the relationship with the service. And it did lead to some people coming back. So I believe that tracing material practices focuses on practices of care that go beyond measurability and translatability into documents. Obviously, these are practices that are co-produced through daily practices by service users, by the recovery practitioners. They can't really be measured. The outcomes of these practices can't always be measured, but they do seem to matter a lot for people who engage with recovery. And by shifting the focus from the provision of information that leads to the right and healthy choices to caring practices that build a shared commitment between the service and its users, we can start thinking and talking about this desire for care that starts emerging within the recovery space. Now I want to discuss some examples from the social recovery assemblage. So towards the end of this project, we used photography to look at how people were engaging with the recovery space, but also how people were engaging with the assemblages where they would be expected to reintegrate in after the end of the recovery process. And these are two images from Athens, and they are from within the recovery space, which was in general seen as a safe space. And what's interesting is when talking about that, these two images within the group, the focus was on temporalities, on how comfortable someone felt in that space, how comfortable they felt sharing very personal parts of the place where they were staying. So I should have said that this is a guest house from the recovery service 18 Nano. So that person was staying there at the time as part of the recovery process. And I'm not going to read through this discussion, but this is a discussion that occurred between the photographer and other participants when they talk about time and all the people that have been in this space before. And it is described as a very safe, intimate, and familiar space. However, this is not the case when we walked outside the recovery space and we were looking at the Athenian social assemblage. Bars and restrictions were a common theme in the pictures, in the photographs that were taken. The person that took this first picture at the top said that that's a church at the back. This touches a lot of different sides of mine, how institutions create this feeling, disappointment that is unfairness and pretended interest. Everything is rusty. This is another picture taken by one of the participants from Athens, and they say it's an image of Athens, double standards, luxuries and modernization, and Europe. Look at this, for example. There are two buildings, relatively new, and I very often feel like I'm the one in the middle, that I'm under pressure from all directions and that I need renovation, and that's what I'm called to do. So using photography, we try to take the question of recovery and position it within social and political assemblages. Now, as I said, context obviously does matter. And in Athens, I was doing that work with the participants around 2018. So 10 years in an ongoing financial and social crisis that obviously led to a lot of pessimism and disapproval of leading institutions. This also speaks to another ongoing issue, like something that kind of characterizes feelings in Greece in terms of belonging. This is the term called a term cultural dualism, which refers to the contradictions that emerge through the encounter of the Ottoman rule with the European Enlightenment. So how Greece is positioned within Eastern and Western traditions. So this first picture of the church is pretty much a visualization of this tension through the problematization of the role of the Orthodox Church in society in Greece. And this image of the two buildings, of the three buildings here, is this participant's identification with non-human components of the Athenian assemblage, and it kind of expresses this collective consciousness of ambiguity. Now, in Liverpool, things were quite different when we started using photography to talk about the social assemblage. This is an example that I really like because it shows how assemblages connect with each other. This is an oil painting that a participant made and then brought a picture of it in the group. And they say that they did it because they felt inspired, because I was doing the art classes at Ginny. I had found the canvas and I had found a bag full of different paints and art materials and stuff. So one day when I just felt like it, I just sat down and did it. I thought, why not? I was pretty pleased with the results. So this is an example of an encounter between the insight of the recovery assemblage. The inspiration comes from the creative practices, the art groups at Ginny, and it also brings the outside in. It's where the materials are found and collected. So the art classes generate a desire that extends to other assemblages, rendering the production of this oil painting possible. This is an image of the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, and this is how the photographer described it. If you're just wandering around, some sort of pointless drunk, and then you only get to see the outside of buildings, I do actually appreciate the architecture and that, but you always feel like you're barred and you're not allowed in or something. So there's that sense of exclusion. So it's like the doorways are a metaphor. You've convinced yourself you don't belong. So you stay outside of everything. But it's nice to have people to like encourage you to sort of take part, I suppose, on the indoor culture side of things. And like in Athens, bars and restrictions were a common theme. In Liverpool, doors that open or close, this buzzer here, they were also very much used to talk about the possibilities that become open when people are part of the recovery space. This is the entrance to a building of a service that this participant was engaging with at the time, and they say, well, I have to press the button and say who I am, and they let me in when I've said who I am, which is like, I still come to terms with that. And then they say, but yeah, well, I suppose it's a symbol of the fact that I'm connected at least. So here doors are symbols of connection, disconnection, and isolation. They're positively presented in the sense that they open when people are in recovery, but also they kind of open up another discussion. They problematize long-standing issues of inclusion and exclusion that the recovering body experiences when trying to extend to other assemblages. So while these doors are open when people are in recovery, they are shut when people are still using or drinking. Accordingly, with the participants from Greece, connections with assemblages beyond recovery are desired, but they are also hostile and threatening. And this is something that came up quite regularly when we were talking about the recovery space in Athens. People were saying that it's great, it's a very protective space, it's a very safe space, it's a very political space, a lot of discussion around solidarity, a lot of care when people are part of this space, but this doesn't really prepare them for a very hostile environment, a hostile society that they have to become part of when they disengage from the recovery process. Which kind of takes me back to the question of care and what does it mean to care and for whom and for how do we care? This is a question that links back to research, the choices we make as researchers, but also how care is produced within the recovery services. I have described some practices of care that I consider positive, but it's also important to remember, and this goes back to how STS studies and feminist epistemologies of care understand this concept of care as a selective mode of attention. Martin et al. Say that it circumscribes and cherishes some things, lives or phenomena as its objects. In the process, it excludes others. I also like Michelle Murphy's definition of care, who says that care is a commitment to be troubled, worried, sorrowed, uneasy, and unsettled, which to me means that, again, we can't really look at practices of care isolated and disconnected from the people, the materials, the assemblages where they evolve. Care is always complex and it's always becoming. And it is important to understand how these connections emerge and how they become meaningful. So again, going back to basically drawing on how feminist epistemologies of care talk about policy, I have argued that the encounters and connections produced in the recovery assemblage render visible the practice of policy as it emerges through small practices of care inside drug treatment services. I think it's very important to focus on a shift from heroic big scale issues to small scale aspects of healthcare. I've tried to describe how shifting desires, and especially how the desire for care that comes from the part of the service users and the desire to care that comes from service workers emerge. This way of thinking and doing policy is an ethical and political imperative that extends beyond spaces of recovery and challenges neoliberal systems of thought that focus on individual choice and responsibility. So again, going back to how people make healthy choices and whether this has to be the responsibility of an individual or of a system, and of the interactions that emerge through caring practices. I believe that policy needs to be transformed from a force that blocks desire to a force that enables desire to flow, needs to shift, again, going back to Anne-Marie Moll's writings on the logic of policy and the logic of care. We also need to move from a logic of policy as an intervention that emerges outside spaces of recovery to a logic of policy as a practice that emerges inside the recovery assemblage. And just to conclude, this is also pretty much how I finished my book. I believe that recovery emerges through a process where an array of human and non-human bodies, forces, affects, and relationships become active. It becomes possible through collective caring practices, through new encounters and another investment of desire. It is by default complex, and it is by staying with the trouble of this complexity that we can start to imagine another logic of policy informed by small daily practices of care. Thank you.